Watch me sculpt a complete plague demon. In this video I show you every step that I made in time-lapse to sculpt this miniature out of a mix between green stuff and milliput. The armature is a white metal spin cast which I sculpted a year ago. Now enjoy the video and don't forget to subscribe, to like and to leave a comment. Here you can see the finished miniature. Now watch me sculpt it from the beginning to the end. I start with sculpting the legs and the feet. First I apply the green stuff milliput mix directly to the metal armature with my fingers and my silicone shapers. Afterwards I use my Zal and Bill dentist tools to get the rough shape of the legs onto the armature. Once this step is done I will add some putty to build up the anatomy of the miniature. Later I add the claws and other details. Here you can see me sculpting the claws of the feet. First I build a rough foot structure. Next I take some putty and press it on top. Afterwards I use my wax 5 to cut out the triangle of the claws. In this case I sculpt 3. Later I use my other sculpting tools to refine the shape. Here I'm adding more putty to build the upper leg muscles. After the anatomy of the legs is done I will rip some flesh down and sculpt some visible muscle structure, add some pimples and cut some parts down to the metal armature bones. All this detailed work should give the impression of some decayed and rotten flesh. To make the muscles visible I add a little piece of putty and cut it around the edges. I pull a little around the edges to make it look like the skin was ripped away. The muscle texture is made with thin wave-like cuts of my wax 5 at both ends of the muscle. small putty balls. I use my sculpting tools to blend the borders of the putty ball with the structure underneath. Here I make a deep cut to the metal armature underneath the putty. I work out the edges of the hole to make it look like a deep wound which makes the bone visible. I add some more of those wounds to the miniature. My ball-headed needle tool to press in the spaces between the claws. Also, I use my wax 5 to give them a little texture with adding small cuts. The legs are finished. Now I will continue with sculpting the body of the miniature. First I add a bigger ball of putty to build the belly of the clay demon. Again I use my hands, sculpting and silicone tools to get the putty sticking to the metal armature. I do the same with adding putty to the backside of the miniature. time for the rest of the upper body. I bring on the first layers of putty and then blend it together with the lower body and the belly. Here I add more putty to build up the buttocks, and I use my sculpting tools to sculpt the anatomy of the back. I blend everything together and smooth the surface. For smoothing I use mostly my silicone shapers or my Biel sculpting tool. Now I add some more putty to cover the head of the armature with putty so that I can later sculpt the face onto. Here I build up the chest with adding some more pieces of putty. Later I will add a small ball of putty for creating the nipple of the visible part of the chest. Now I got the rough shape of the body finished. I use my ball-headed needle to push in the belly button, and I cut into the belly to make some guts visible. Also I prepare 2 holes where I will later add some copper wire as an armature for some guts hanging out of the belly. Some pimples will also be added to the belly and the body. Also a part of his chest muscle will be laid open by simply cutting into the chest. sculpt a part of his left rib cage. First I add some putty to the torso. Then I simply cut the ribs into the putty and use my ball-headed needle and other sculpting tools to give them more depth. Body is finished. Next up I will sculpt the face of the plague demon. First of all I put a thin layer of putty over the head and work it onto the layer underneath. Afterwards I add a small cured ball of putty for the eyeball. Later I add the mass of the face by adding small pieces of putty step by step. Here I add the lower jaw. The tooth will be later cut in and a small putty snake will be the tongue hanging out of his mouth. Here you can see me working out the expression of his face and adding the other details with various sculpting tools. A lot of pushing the putty is necessary to get the face done properly. I push a little hole into his head to have an indication where I will later add the horn by drilling into the cured putty. Finally, I add the ears by adding 2 flat pieces of putty. First I work the edges onto the putty of the head and later I push in the details of the auricle. Here you see the finished head and face. Next up I will add some copper wire to the head for the horn, and I will add a wire to the bellies and armature for the guts hanging out. The copper wire is drilled into the cured wire and stuck in place. Now I add some putty for the horn and cover the belly wire with a first layer of putty. Sculpting around a wire without understructure can be tricky. It requires some sculpting experience and patience while chasing the putty around the wire. At this point I'm using my ball-headed needle to push in the single segments of the cone. First I start with the front and then I work my way around. Some details to the horn by simply cutting into the putty. I add thin cuts from the base to the top to create the texture of the horn. Here you see the result. Now only his arms and his two-handed sword are missing. For the arms I start with building up a rough anatomy. I simply add a sausage of putty to the armature and use my sculpting tools to get it in place. Later I add some more putty for the arm muscles. Here you can see me sculpting the hands. First I simply laid a layer of putty around the armature-like and fingerless glove. The thumb will be added with a small piece of putty. The fingers will be cut in. They will get more depth later with my ball-headed needle and other sculpting tools. Some pimples, cuts, wounds and late opened muscles and bones will be added once everything else is in place. and the arms are finished. Here I forgot to make a close-up video of the arms. Now only the sword is missing. I drilled in some copper wire as an armature for the two-handed blade. For the base of the blade I simply wrap some putty around the wire and sculpt it flat. This doesn't have to be perfect because I can sand and file the blade into my desired shape once the putty is completely cured. Since I want to give the sword a flame-like look, I push my build tool in various parts of the edges of the blade. Later I use my silicone shapers and other tools to get the blade flat again. This is the final result of the blade. Once the putty was dried, I sand and filed it into a more cleaner shape. And now the miniature is completely finished. If you have any questions depending my sculpting steps or else, just feel free to put it in the comments below and I will answer them as soon as possible. Thanks for watching and don't forget to like this video and to subscribe to my channel.